Deal or no deal, U.S. President Donald Trump has launched a series of sweeping tariffs across the globe. Canada was no exception. After we failed to reach a deal with the U.S., President Donald Trump hit Canada with 35% tariffs on all goods that are not compliant with CUSMA. There's also a 50% tariff on copper, steel, and aluminum, and a long list of countries have already made deals before today's deadline. Those include the EU, the UK, and South Korea, some of those who managed to negotiate lower tariffs, and they did so by agreeing to invest in American products. For more on who has a deal, who doesn't, and where we sit this morning, we're joined by Rendell, economic reporter for the Globe and Mail. Great to have you here in studio. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me here.
Okay, not only did Canada not reach a deal, we ended up in the top 5 of tariff rates globally. And those tariff rates for people who are just tuning in this morning range anywhere from 10 to 41%. So we're sitting at 35. First of all, which countries were able to negotiate a deal with this administration, and what deals has the U.S. made so far?
Yeah, so the big headline news coming yesterday was that Trump has put tariffs on dozens of countries, or increased tariffs on dozens of countries. We're now talking double-digit tariffs on much of the world. There has been a series of deals that the president has struck with countries and trading partners in recent months and weeks. The European Union, Japan, South Korea. The UK struck a deal several months ago. So Canada also had its tariffs increased last night. These are these broad-based tariffs that apply to Canadian goods that don't trade under the North American Free Trade Agreement, or CUSMA.
Yeah.
The main thing to keep in mind there, though, is those tariffs only affect a very small portion of actual Canadian trade because of this broad-based exemption. So while it looks like Canada's been hit very hard by going 25 to 35%, remember that only applies to a small portion of goods. So Canada is actually still in a relatively solid position compared to all of these other countries that have been hit.
Yeah, that was my question for this morning, is does that CUSMA compliance mitigate this 35% or offset in any way the 35%, the impact?
It does, massively so, yeah. So about 60% of Canadian goods were CUSMA compliant, or exports to the U.S. were CUSMA compliant in May. The Bank of Canada thinks that could go up to as much as 95%. So to kind of break that down, while we hear these big headline numbers, 25%, 35%, the average effective tariff rate on Canadian goods is only about 5%. Now, that may have gone up a tiny bit, but it's only about 5% because of these CUSMA exemptions. Now, there are still sectoral specific tariffs on the auto industry, on steel, aluminum, copper today. Those mean these specific industries are being hit very hard. Again, that's a 50% tariff on steel and aluminum, copper, and autos, with a slight carve out on autos. But when we're talking about the broad base, like the whole amount of Canadian trade going to the US, the average effective rate is only about 5%. And that's something that's really important to keep in mind when we're talking about where we sit relative to other countries. So not good news, especially not good news for the sectors that are being really hit. But we also got to keep in perspective, where we stand relative to pretty much every other trading partner. And the answer to that is Canada still has relatively good access to the United States.
Well, this is a bit of a bright light in what felt very dark this morning when you see 35% across the board. You did this great breakdown in the Globe and Mail of who got what by doing what. So I want to show that list of people. Of the countries that did manage to swing a deal by the deadline, they did so by what Trump described in one of his Truth Social posts as buy downs. What concessions were made? So these are the countries that have a deal. What concessions were made?
So to start, the countries that agreed to a deal with the U.S. still ended up with a baseline tariff. And that's really important to keep in mind. Like, we're not going back to a world in which there's free trade. Average tariffs that the U.S. has put on everybody in the world, about 6 times higher than it was before. But the countries who did agree to an agreement did manage to get basically an average tariff between 10 and 20%. They managed to, as you say, kind of buy that down by promising to open their market somewhat to U.S. goods, but also promising to invest, hundreds of billions of dollars into the U.S. economy and to buy large amounts of U.S. goods. So that changes country to country. The EU agreed to buy about $750 billion worth of U.S. energy. Now, you got to remember, Europe's trying to get off Russian energy because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Many of these countries that have struck deals with the U.S. have agreed to buy Boeing jets. The UK has agreed to buy more beef, all this kind of stuff. So there is a way in which you can see what Donald Trump is doing right now is basically being the salesman in chief for America. He's going around, he's threatening countries with a big stick.
I've heard a lot of titles for him, but that's the first I've heard.
Yeah, he's going around with a big stick and threatening people and basically saying, if you do not open your markets, if you do not commit to buying U.S. goods and you do not commit to investing in the U.S., we are going to hit you with higher tariffs. Now, the takeaway from the deals we've seen in recent months and what we saw yesterday is that the tariffs aren't as high as Mr. Trump threatened back in April. You might remember Liberation Day.
Yeah, Liberation Day.
He came out in the Rose Garden holding this big placard with double-digit tariffs on everyone. So the tariffs that have actually were announced in the executive order yesterday and which were in the deals that were struck in recent weeks, they are lower than those Liberation Day tariffs, but they're still, and we're still in a world in which tariffs are higher than they've been since the 1930s. It is a world in which free trade, at least with the U.S., is no longer free, or I should say trade with the U.S. is no longer free. And as Canada, Canadian negotiators are still in Washington. They're still trying to strike some sort of deal. What that will look like, we probably should look at what happened to Japan, what happened to the EU, others, and that may potentially be a model for, if Canada does strike a deal, it might look like that. But the key point, and as I mentioned off the top, the thing that's protecting the Canadian economy and the reason we are not in a recession yet is because we have this Continental Free Trade Agreement, CUSMA, called the USMCA, depending on what you want to call it. We used to call it NAFTA. A big focus of Canadian negotiators going forward has to be the 2026 renewal of the USMCA, because without that trade agreement, that kind of 5% average effective tariff rate I mentioned at the beginning is going to go up to that 35%. And that's something Canadians really want to avoid.
In the words of Meghan Markle, no deal yet. It could still be coming. All right, Mark Rendell, it's great to have you with us this morning. Economic reporter for the Globe and Mail. Lots of information to get through, and you did so well. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you like that video, make sure to subscribe to the Your Morning YouTube feed, where you can find all kinds of new content posted every weekday morning.